Hello, everyone. I just want to test to make sure that everyone can hear me. Andy, can you just let me know if you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to attend the webinar. Once again, before we get started, I think everyone has figured it out, but with the Blue Jean software, on the right-hand side at the bottom here, you'll see the video off and your audio. If you could put that on off, that would be great. As well as you've noted here in the chat, where we can list any questions that you have throughout the presentation. Okay, so the title of our webinar today is there a significant difference? An introduction to comparing nutrition survey results. So to start off, I just wanted to mention my name is Scott Logue. I am the Tech RRT Assessment Advisor. I've been with the team for about 2.5 years now, I think, and I've been on 5 different deployments. And Andy, if you could just introduce yourself.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Kenzel. I'm the Tech RRT Program Manager. Yep, and I've been with the team for 2 years.
Thank you very much. So for today's webinar, Andy's going to present just a brief background of the Tech RRT, the guidelines for the webinar. So this is just a couple points to help ensure that the webinar runs smoothly. Then I'll talk about the rationale for the webinar. So this is basically observations and questions from colleagues that people asked me when I was in the field that led me to believe that this type of webinar is warranted and it'll be useful for people in the field. Then we'll talk about the types of surveys. So before we get into discussing the CDC Calculator and how we can use this tool, it's important to do a little bit of background of when it's appropriate to use it. So we'll discuss the common types of surveys, such as exhaustive surveys, surveys with a representative sample, as well as samples of convenience. Then we'll talk about what types of surveys can be compared. So after reviewing the types of surveys, we'll discuss which ones can be compared, and as well as the context that when it is appropriate to compare them. And we'll also go over just brief examples of confidence intervals when you're comparing surveys. It's just one slide that just gives very rudimentary examples. And then we'll get into using the CDC Calculator tool, and we will compare indicators comparing 2 different surveys, as well as comparing indicators within 1 survey. Okay, Andy, if you could start us off here. I'll do no need to switch over.
Great. So just a brief introduction to what is the Tech RRT. The Tech RRT, it's a technical rapid response team, which is actually a mechanism to support collective work for nutrition and emergencies, but also now we do support individual agencies as well. So if you think, if there's a need in an emergency to improve the technical quality of the response or assessments for the response, feel free to reach out to us. It's a consortium led by International Medical Corps in partnership with Action Against Hunger and Save the Children. We have been funded by USAID, by OFTA. Our project started back in August of 2015, and now we currently have funding through the end of February of 2019. We work in close collaboration with the Global Nutrition Cluster and UNICEF. Our objectives are to improve the overall emergency nutrition response, and we do that by deploying technical advisors, but also by providing technical remote support. That includes initiatives like this webinar, which is a capacity strengthening series that we're doing in each of the technical areas that we have advisors to address weaknesses that are seen in the field. Okay. If you have any questions or would like to know more about us, feel free to reach out. Always happy to discuss more. Thank you. Back over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. And I noticed that I didn't have the Tech RRT email there. So at the end of the presentation, when we send out the evaluation, I'll make sure to include the Tech RRT website as well. Okay, so the rationale for this webinar. So basically, in the field, I go on deployments and working with colleagues, I noticed some things that were happening that perhaps could be improved. So the types of questions that people were asking me, which will be covered in this webinar, is what types of surveys can be compared? And can surveys from different areas be compared? And how to properly compare indicators to boys versus girls within a survey. A lot of times you'd have point prevalences. So these are cluster surveys, and the numbers obviously aren't the same. They might be close, but then people might be reporting and saying that there's a difference between the boys and girls, but they weren't articulating properly if it's actually a significant difference. So that's important. So we're going to review that today. The guidelines for the webinar. So just to note that this is being recorded, and so a link will be sent to all the participants when it's available. So this I would predict maybe by mid-October. So I will send that to everyone as well. It will be available on Tech RRT website as well. So like we mentioned before, if you have a question, please type it on the right-hand side of the screen. And Andy, if you don't mind, if I miss them, can you please remind me?
Of course.
And then also, either today or tomorrow, we'll be sending you a short webinar evaluation form. So I promise it will be short, 5 minutes at the most. So please kindly complete this, so then we can use this information to improve for webinars in the future, and we also have to report on this as well. Thank you very much in advance.
Before you go on, Scott, could I just jump in for just a second to ask everyone, if you haven't introduced yourselves already in the chat window, if you could just introduce yourselves there, that would be great. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, because I use this information to align it with your emails that you sent me, so that I know who to send the evaluation to that attended the webinar. Okay, so types of surveys. So an exhaustive survey, for example, if you had a nutrition survey in a camp setting, and there was children from 6 to 59 months, and all the children in the camp are included. So this would likely be a small camp with a population of less than 5,000. So if you found that there was a global acute malnutrition of 9%, oh, before we go on, just someone's got their audio on.
I believe it's Lucy Mena. Lucy, if you can hear us, would you mind putting your microphone on mute? If you go to the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an audio button with a microphone. Please click there. Lucy, can you hear me?
Hi, Lucy. I think you just joined. Perhaps over here, Lucy Mena on the audio. Oh, I think there we go on the right hand side. Oh, maybe not.
No,
okay.
Not yet. Muted.
Yeah?
Can you show again, Scott, please?
Okay. So I think there's a couple of people that just joined. So throughout the webinar, if you could please have your video off, and then the audio, if you click this on the bottom right hand side of the screen, it'd be great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll go on. Okay, so I mentioned so if you had an example with the global acute malnutrition in an exhaustive survey, this would be, for example, if it was around 5,000 population less or less, you might have 100 children, not that many, 659 months. So there's no need to do a sample, a representative sample. So what you have is called a true population value. You have measured every child 6 to 59 months. So you are 100% confident that the true population value of GAM is 9%. So that's one type of survey. So the next is a representative survey. So it has a representative sample. So a representative surveys, it takes place when a survey population is too large and does not make sense to use resources. So, for example, in terms of human resources, financial, time, etc., that are needed to obtain a sufficient result that can be used for programming. So, to be honest, this is the most common type of survey. We have cluster surveys, and you have a sample. So it's a couple important points to make with representative sampling is that each individual or your sampling unit in the population has a known 0 chance or probability of being selected. So for example, every 6 to 59 month child has the same opportunity or chance of being selected. Another point, so another key point in representative sampling is the selection of one individual should be independent of the selection of another. For example, so if you select one child from one family, this does not guarantee that their cousin in another household will be selected. They could be, but it is completely random selection. So when we have a sample that the result will actually be a point prevalence, which is an estimate. So what we have here as an example, you have a GAM, once again, 9%. You have a confidence interval of 7 to 11%. So and this is the most common. It's a 95% confidence interval. So that just means if you were to repeat the survey 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, you would have your point prevalence between 7 and 11%. So the last type of survey I'd like to talk about is a sample of convenience. So for example, children are gathered in the town center for a Vhat measurement, let's say, after a natural disaster. Not every child has an equal chance of being selected. So there's many reasons for this. So perhaps the very sick children are in a hospital and they're not included. Maybe some caretakers are embarrassed to bring their sick child, and maybe they didn't know about the survey. There's many different reasons. So that's example of sample of convenience. So it is not a representative survey. So what types of surveys can be compared? So exhaustive surveys, they can be compared. So for example, in a camp setting, a small camp, let's say, once again, if it's less than 5,000, in a camp setting, you might do a survey 2 years apart. One year, then 2 years later, 1 year later, you can compare those two types of surveys. The surveys that have a representative sampling method can also be compared. So for example, if you had 2 SMART surveys, or perhaps you had a 30 by 30 cluster sample and a SMART survey. Even though these are slightly different survey methodologies, they're still representative samples. So these surveys can be compared. So the important point is that both surveys are representative of the survey population and of all children they had the same opportunity to be selected for the surveys. Now for the next one, so it's not recommended to compare surveys that use samples of convenience. There's a lot of caution. It's because not all children had an equal chance of being selected in the surveys. So the result, and so if these had been representative surveys, the results would likely be very different. And same with the last one. It's not recommended to compare surveys with a representative sample with a survey that used a sample of convenience, like apples and oranges. And it's not recommended to compare. So comparing two surveys. So here's some examples of when it's appropriate to compare two surveys. So if you have a baseline survey and an endline survey. So for example, let's say an organization, they conducted a baseline survey and then they had a program running for a couple of years and they want to see if the programs are still needed. Has the situation improved enough? So they might conduct a potential endline survey in the same area. So that is very appropriate. So for program monitoring, so this would be, once again, if an organization has a program running that for a few years, perhaps every 6 months they conduct a survey, or a year, depending on the goals, objectives, comparing the same season from 1 year to the next. So this, for example, you might compare the lean season from 2017 to 2018. That's an example. Comparing different seasons. So this is not as common. A lot of times it will depend on resources, but where you do see it is it's good to do this in areas where there's not a lot of previous nutrition information. So for example, you might have a survey that's conducted in the lean season and then another survey conducted after a harvest, when theoretically the level of malnutrition should be lower. So it's a good way to get more information if it's not available. So for national surveys consisting of independent representative surveys. So this, for example, if you had, let's say there's 10 governorates in a country and they have a national SMART survey, they might conduct 10 individual SMART surveys, one for each governorate. Now, because these are independent surveys, it's representative of that area. So because of that, you can compare the two surveys and you can use the results to prioritize programming. I'm sure there's some other examples as well. So now, before we get to the CDC Calculator, I just wanted to briefly go over 3 examples here. So for confidence intervals, example 1 would be, so this would be the low end of the confidence interval, and this would be the high end. So the point prevalences aren't listed, and that's done on purpose because we're just trying to, I just want to discuss, significant difference, as well as point prevalence, and this is an additional note, is not as meaningful as the confidence intervals. Confidence intervals are the most important as opposed to the point prevalence in representative sampling. So here you have the low confidence interval and the high confidence interval on this survey. This survey, so the survey 1, survey 2. This survey, here's the low end, the high end. You'll notice that they're not overlapping. There's no overlap at all, and they're actually a little bit, well, quite a ways apart. So when you see this, we'll get into some examples after, but this means that there is a significant difference between the surveys. The second example, so this here, the survey 1 and then survey 2. if you see that these confidence intervals, they're overlapping a lot, there's no significant difference between the two surveys. And the third example, this is what we're focusing on a lot today. It's the situations or the context when there is a little bit of overlap. Sometimes what we'll see in these examples is, yes, there will be a significant difference, and then sometimes, no, it won't. So it's these types of situations when using the CDC calculator makes things very, very relevant. Okay, so these are the examples that we're going to be doing. So after I do this slide, I'll bring up the CDC calculator. So for the first example, oops, sorry. I'm going to show it's quite similar to the previous slide. So the confidence intervals, they do not overlap. And these are the numbers that I'm going to be using with a bit more information. And the second, they overlap, so there's no significant difference. And the third, they do overlap a little, and we have to determine, is there a significant difference? And yes, there is. So now I'm going to, give me a sec. I'm going to introduce the CDC calculator. Okay, so this here is called the CDC Calculator 2 survey test. So we're going to use this for the first examples for 2 surveys, and then I'm also going to use this as well for comparing results within one survey. So just please don't be confused, even though it says 2 surveys. I'll explain. So the information here at the bottom, you'll notice that there's 3 different tabs. The CDC calculator uses a t-test. So basically, you have to determine the information that you have available. So a lot of times, this is the majority of the times, what I've found in the field, whatnot, you might not have access to the data set. So you can't run it through enough for Smarts or any other software to determine design effect. So this middle tab here, 2 sample t-test, no design effect. This is what's most commonly used. Now, information that you need, so most times you can get this information just from a survey report. Like I said, I think we can all agree a lot of times getting the actual raw data for the data set itself is difficult. If you can, it's great. But we can still use information from survey reports. So the information that you need is the number. So this is, in our case, these examples I'm going to be here, it's going to be for global acute malnutrition. So the number is the number of children. The prevalence is the point prevalence, and then you have to have the 2 confidence intervals. So the lower end and the upper end of the confidence interval, and the number of clusters. So then what we'll notice at the bottom, which is important here, is this P. So basically, when you put in this information, if the p-value, if it's less than 0.05, there is a significant difference between 2 surveys. So this is the very user-friendly tool that can help determine a significant difference between 2 surveys, as well as some indicators within 1 survey. In terms of the 2-sided test and 1-sided test, I don't really want to touch on too much about that within this webinar. It's not as relevant. But basically, if you're going to use a 1-sided test, you have to say a priori, before you have to make the statement before you compare. It's before you compare the two surveys that you're very confident that there's going to be a significant difference. But for this, for the most part, even reporting, you can usually when you're reporting, you're just going to be reporting the p-value anyways. So that's what's most important. Okay, so let's do some examples and get into the fun stuff. All right, so for the first survey, so once again, I'm going to be using, if everyone can follow me, I'm going to be using these examples here. So 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to be plugging in this information. So for the first survey, there's a little bit more information. So there's 600 children. Prevalence 12. Confidence intervals 9, 15. The number of clusters 30. I think someone has their audio on.
Yes, I believe we've had a couple new people join, so perhaps you can explain again quickly how to turn it off.
Hi everyone anyone who just joined. To the people who just joined, could you please go on the blue jeans in the bottom right side. You'll see audio here. If you could click that to off, that would be great. This person, Annalie Carey.
And Sadiq. Great, Sadiq has turned his off. And Annalie Carey still has hers on. Annalie, if you can turn off your microphone on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, that would be much appreciated. Great, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Okay, so for the second survey, there's 500 children. The point prevalence is 5. And you have a confidence interval 2, 8, and you had 29 clusters. So for this example, you'll notice that, I'll bring it back up again. It's similar to this. The confidence intervals, they do not overlap. They do not overlap. So yes, there is a significant difference. If you look at the p-value, it's less than 0.05. So this is an example of a significant difference. So for the second example, it would be similar to this. You can visualize how there's going to be an overlap in the confidence intervals using these numbers. For example 2, we'll keep it the same with 600 children, and we'll change the point prevalence is 7. The lower is 4, the upper is 10. Keep the same number of clusters, 30. For the second survey, keep it 500. Give you the point prevalence of 11. 8, 14. Same number clusters. So you'll notice here the p-value is above 0.05. So there's no significant difference. So just to get a visual once again, so it kind of looks like, well, this would actually slit over a bit more. It doesn't overlap quite as much as this, but the point is that they overlap. Okay, now for the third example, it's going to be a slight overlap. So this will be, these are the situations for the third example. This is when the CDC calculator is very user-friendly and it comes in handy a lot. I use it a lot for all of my analysis. There's a little bit of an overlap. So for the first example, once again, we'll keep it at 600. And then we have a point prevalence of 10. Confidence intervals 7 to 13. Number of clusters the same. The second with your 500. Point prevalence 15. And this will go from, let's say, 11.5. You know, so there's a bit of an overlap to 18.5. This example, there is a significant difference. Just to reiterate the point here, there's a slight overlap between the surveys, and in this example, there is a significant difference. Sometimes there's not, so that's why it's important to do this test. A couple other additional points that I'd like to make. So these examples that I just did are the most common. So that's why I chose them. I wanted this webinar to be very, I guess, user-friendly for things that you commonly see in the field. So that's why I did just, I did global acute malnutrition. But you can also do the exact same procedure, the results that you find in survey reports with moderate acute malnutrition, MAM, as well as severe acute malnutrition, SAM. You can also do it with stunting, moderate stunting, severe stunting. It's all, you can do it for all of these. So these other two tabs, so now, like I said, this example here, if you have a survey report, now survey reports, they really should include the design effect, but the reality is a lot of times they don't. But if you had a survey results from two different surveys, and if the report itself had the design effect, or if you had access to the data set and you could run through ENIF for Smart or perhaps other software to determine design effect, if you have that information, you would use this tab. And I'm not going to go through any examples here because it's exactly the same information. You have except you don't have to have the design effect, but because you already have it, you don't have to determine it. So here you have the number, you have the prevalence, the design effect, and the number of clusters. So for here, you don't have to enter the confidence intervals. The most common, like I said, so for this, the 2-sample t-test for no design effect and with design effect, these are for cluster samples. This last tab doesn't occur as often, but if you have a survey that has a simple random sample, meaning that there isn't clusters, they just select from the population and they run a simple random sample, you would use this tab. But to be honest, I think from my experience, at least 80% of the time, it's using the middle tab. So that's why we did the examples there. Okay. Now let's do an example. Before we go on, is there any questions comparing the two surveys? Next, I'm going to be using this same tool to compare stunting, boys and girls within one survey. So
Hi, this is Julie. Sorry, I have a quick question. The design effect you input in the beginning when you're calculating your sample size, is often different than the design effect that is reported at the end of the survey after it's conducted, right?
That's a
And
great question. Yeah.
so
Oh,
are you
yeah.
inputting the one that's reported at the end, right?
Yes, that's correct. That's a very good point. So the question is, at the beginning of a survey, so basically when you're gathering information during when you're making your survey protocol, you have to you have to obtain information to create your sample size calculation. And one of the items that you need is your design effect. So that's basically that's your estimated what it's going to be. Now, this is done common actually. This is a very good question. A lot of times people will just report what they did when planning, during the survey planning. But you're 100% right. You have to use the results of your survey. It doesn't matter about the planning because you might have overestimated the design effect or you might have underestimated. So you're going to use the observed, what you actually observed from your survey. That's what you use for the design effect.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's go for one survey example. So I'm actually going to bring up a real survey that was conducted. And this is just to show you like a real world example of how you use this. So you have a survey report. For this, we want to compare stunting with boys and girls. So this would be a typical table you'd see in survey report. You have its prevalence of stunting based on height for age, Z scores, and by sex. So here's the total. There's the moderate stunting and severe stunting. There's all the children. Then you have the boys and the girls. So we want to see if there is a significant difference between the boys and the girls. So for this survey, I'm going to do the total stunting. So for here, so this is the information here that I'm going to be entering. You have boys and the girls. You have the prevalence here, and then you have the lower and upper confidence intervals. So you'll see the boys is actually, it's higher, it's almost 3% higher than the girls. So we want to see if there is a significant difference. Now, just comparing these two, we can tell, but I just want to go through the exercise. So this is the information here that I'm going to be entering. So for this exercise, or for this example now, even though it says survey 1, survey 2, please don't be confused. For this example, this is one survey, but you're going to have the boys, it'll be survey 1, and the girls will be survey 2. Now, for this example, this is very odd, to be honest. I mean, for this survey, we found there was exactly the same number of boys and girls, which is good for an example, but in the majority of the times, and this might be the first time ever when there was exactly the same. There's usually at least a few different between boys and girls. So usually the number of children, number of boys, number of girls is going to be different. But for our example here, we had 274 boys. The prevalence was 23. Point prevalence was 23. Confidence interval 17.7. The upper 29.3. And the number of clusters, I think there was 33 in this survey. So then you have the girls, which is 274. Like I said, normally the boys and girls are not going to be the same, but for this particular survey it was. The point prevalence was 20.1. Lower confidence interval was 15.2. And the upper is 26. Now, because we're using because this is results from the same survey, it's always going to be the same number of clusters. Now, just before we interpret the results here, I'll just go back. So just to reiterate, the information I entered was the boys, information here, and the girls. So for this survey, you'll see that you have, there was overlap in the confidence intervals, and it was way above 0.05, so there was no significant difference between the boys and girls. For example. Now that concludes all of the information that I wanted to present today in the webinar. But now I'd like to open it up to some questions. If anyone has any questions about anything that was presented today. And once again, so this was just an introduction today to go over you know, the CDC calculator and basically different scenarios in the field when this can be used. I forgot to mention as well, for this example with, I just did an example here using stunting, but you can also compare GAM to boys and girls. You can do MAM and SAM. You could do, excuse me, severe stunting. Like for example, here you could do, you could do the moderate stunting. And here would be the number of boys. And with girls, you can do moderate stunting, severe stunting. You can do, yeah, and you can do GAM. You can do underweight as well. So the example I did was for stunting, but you can also use it for additional variables as well, or indicators. Okay, so now we'll open it up to some questions.
Sorry, okay, sorry, I was on mute. Scott, there's been one.
Hello, Andy? Andy? Can everyone just let me know if they can anyone let me know if they can hear me? I think Andy's blue jeans just went off.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. So I'm just going to put some of these questions here. Okay. Do I have the link to this calculator from the CDC website? So I actually did a quick Google search. I couldn't find this. I couldn't find it on the CDC website, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. So I'll have to look again.
Sorry, I did find it. I can share the link in the chat window in just a couple of seconds.
From the CDC website?
No, not on the CDC website, but I did find it.
I know for a fact it's available from the Smart Methodology website. So that's smartmethodology.org. So I think it's in their resources, but if not, I know for sure it's on the Smart website.
Scott, there's another question in the chat menu coming from Amanda. Can this calculator be used for other variables other than anthropometrics, i.e., for example, hand washing prevalence?
Yes, it can, and I have done it in the past as well. So basically, if you have within one survey, you could do hand washing practices because you'd still have the number, maybe it's the individual, the household, and as long as you have the prevalence and the lower and upper confidence intervals that you have from your results, you know the number of clusters. So yes, it can be used beyond just anthropometric nutrition indicators. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time once again for attending the webinar. And we will have this recorded version available, I think, probably within a couple of weeks. And I will send it by email, but it will also be uploaded to the Tech RRT website. But once again, to everyone, thank you very much, and I hope this was useful, and then you can use it in the field. Okay, take care.